stars, fire, temples, time. In this lecture, we're going to review the last lecture. We're also going to talk about a concept I call the sink of wealth. We're going to look ahead at some of the concepts that are going to be with us during the whole semester about the atom and about the universe, and we're also going to look at science in the ancient world. In last week's lecture, we asked, what does progress actually mean? And which scientific discoveries and changes are truly significant? In terms of progress, we thought about progress in terms of the technology, the efficiency of the tool. We also thought about it in terms of our own lives, what we might want out of science. We said that history is significant because something has made a permanent change or a very large change, or had some potential or quality that we want to notice as being big. We also said there's such a thing as negative significance, something that can't be gotten back or can't be fixed. This is what we talked about when we talked about progress and significance. We also defined science. We said that science was the attempt to uncover hidden forces, unknown causes and effects by using specialized observation techniques and specially built instruments for the purposes of controlling, directing, and predicting those forces. And lightning is a really good example of something that we really can't control or direct or predict thoroughly, but is an excellent example of a natural force that we have been studying for years and still has devastating effects now. I'll give the definition to you again. In order to improve our lives and satisfy our curiosity, we use specialized instruments to make new and repeated observations so that we can explain the hidden causes of events and predict future events. So in both of those definitions, there was observation and repetition of the observation. There was storing information so that you could get back to it and compare it. That implies writing. It also implies some kind of library or some kind of system for organizing what you know. We have tool-assisted knowledge gathering. In other words, maybe we have a giant henge that helps us line up when the solstice is going to be. Or maybe we have a telescope or something else. But we're using something to help us with those repeated observations. We also really want to understand cause and effect. And sometimes you do things over and over again, almost like a ritual, because you're trying to understand what causes what. And then, of course, a last element in this definition is something about wonder or the sublime, the things that are bigger than we are, that go beyond what we understand. The sublime is a concept, a philosophical concept. We often use it to apply to mountains or to parts of the earth that make us feel very small. We don't often use it in the terms of science, but I really think that science does make us feel small and compared to the things that we don't understand fully. Well, I had put prehistory in the page of science by saying that I think that even prehistorically, before people were exactly writing things down, they still had problems to solve, like how do I keep from being eaten? And they also had things that they wanted to do. They wanted to make a mark on the world, and they wanted to use tools to do that. You can see that they were making repeat observations and that they were making both exact and specific as well as representational. And last but not least, the most recent research suggests that they were using geometric signs over many years, which had a specific meaning. They were symbolic cultures that conveyed their meaning by symbols. And I had mentioned a really terrific book you might want to read in that context. So that's getting us up to speed. Now let's move on. In this week's lecture, I want to talk about something I call the sink of wealth. It's an object or a location that has attracted a lot of sight and labor, something that's so intense, so fixed, that you couldn't get the money, the time, the wealth back out of that in any other way. It's fixed there, in that place, just emoting whatever it does emote for as long as we can see into the future. Temples and cathedrals and some tombs, some major social projects, they all have this feature of being a sink of wealth. And if you've ever stood in front of one of these where you've just felt like thousands of years and thousands of man hours and labor and tears and time have gone into this, and it's holding all of that, it is a very sublime feeling. You feel kind of small in front of it. But I would also say that this, in the ancient world, attracted scientists. Anybody who was doing something complex, mathematical, a little past what the rest of us can do, anyone who had a lot of money who was willing to pay for it, science came around or into the picture. And that was certainly true with the Hagia Sophia, as we'll come back to. This is a building that has a 1,500-year history. It's a place of work, wealth, building, political interaction. It's an enormous church, or it was to begin with. It's become an enormous mosque now, but it was an enormous church, and it was the largest building in the world when it was built in 537. And it was also a huge complex of buildings. It wasn't just one church. So when they built it, they also had to build the administrative structure to go with it. So building maintenance attracts scholars and practitioners solving problems that typically use some kind of science, at the very least some kind of math. So you're looking for this. You're looking for sinks of wealth, because when you see them, you're going to find science. And just to be a little more specific about this particular building, it's incredibly beautiful. It's the embodiment in stone of math and ideas about authority and beauty and perfection and light and the heavens. It also has a bunch of gold mosaics, expressive particularly of the idea that I gave this money. There's a vestibule mosaic from the 10th century that shows two donors, Justinian and Constantine. And then there's also an image of an emperor and his empress, that's on the right there, on the lower right, that are shown making a donation to the church. So they're not kidding when I say sink of wealth. It definitely, on the walls of the building itself, it records that people gave money to this thing. So that's just something to know about when you're thinking of a sink of wealth. I'll give you two other examples. One which I think you could imagine yourself, the pyramids. The pyramids, once that effort went in, it's never gone back out. It's been an attractor to the world for the rest of time, pretty much. And it's anchored right now a thriving tourism business and still science. Recently they used a kind of special LiDAR to check whether or not there were any other chambers in the main pyramid. In fact, they found one. So still attracting science from 4,000 years ago when it was first built. Then on the right, this is just a little something that when first I saw it, I couldn't shake. It's a malachite urn, and it's incredibly heavy. It was brought all the way from a mine at Ekaterinburg to St. Petersburg. You couldn't put anything in it. You couldn't use it for anything. The effort it took to haul this giant bit of stone, 9 days by train, 1,000 miles away. All the effort is sunk into that one thing. So as you see these things, you might think to yourself, what did it take to produce this? Who was involved in this? And can that effort ever be gotten back out? So the squirrel, as I mentioned, takes you to some things you might want to look at. This one was one of them. There's a terrific Amazon Prime Heritage Masterpiece Season 18-part series examining the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. It's weird. It's interesting. I recommend that you take a moment and look at it. I have the link in the notes. Okay, let's get going with the ancient world. We're going to start with something in 11,000 BCE, Göbekli Tepe. Then we're going to take a quick walk around the world just to look at what people are doing all the way around the world to manage time. And then we're going to stop with the aqueducts in Rome. One of the true mysteries and more recent discoveries is the Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey. And it's dated around 11,000 BCE, and it's frankly puzzling. It could be the world's oldest known temple. A German archaeologist named Carl Schmitt is called the discoverer because he first recognized its importance, and he started excavating it in 1995. The thing that our archaeologist Carl Schmitt noticed was there didn't seem to be a whole lot of developed metals or tools or pottery. There are these 4 rings surrounding each other. Each ring has a roughly similar layout, and in the center are these large T-shaped pillars that have carvings up and down the side of them. Oxes, lions, scorpions, vultures. And so he wondered, because he didn't see a lot of household goods, whether or not this was some kind of a site for worship. And then this period in human history, prehistory, isn't really the right time for settled cities. And we always imagined that temples were an effect of living in a settled place. So this is a puzzle because it seems like people were building temples before they were building cities. That's a curious point. I've given you a couple of links in the notes to figure that out. So just keep this in your mind as a developing site that people are still interested in. All right, let's take a walk around the world, 2500 BCE. You can see in the upper left, Stonehenge. People are building giant clocks to try to understand when the solstice is coming and possibly to do some ritualistic, we don't know what. But there are some burials there. There's some great sound effects there. So we're certain that people are gathering to put these giant megaliths up that take some kind of technology. And they were hauled from a certain distance away. They weren't just put up on the site. So we're seeing that already people are organizing, they're putting things together. We're not quite certain why they're doing it, but we know that they are doing it. Below that, on the left again, Norte Chico, this is in South America. Giant platforms, again, lots and lots of effort built to make city centers. Then on the bottom there, you see the pyramids, that's in Egypt. Going upward, you see you see the ziggurats of again, giant building projects to mark what? Certainly some of it is observations of the heavens. Then we have the Indus Valley, which is an Indus civilization, which had the earliest indoor bathrooms and plumbing, and for all intents and purposes, we believe it was a fairly egalitarian city. That we're not quite sure of, but it looks like they didn't have a very strong centralized organizing force. And then the last in the upper right, I've included something smaller. These are jade B. They were made in China and also in Korea. These are very hard stones, so the technology and time it would take to produce one of these round, beautiful round items is kind of hard to fathom. Why would people do it? And so both in large and small works of hand, and you'll see this use of technology and developing science. And that's in a walk around the world. All right, let's pause on the Romans, because the Romans did something and built something that really isn't a mystery. They liked and wanted clean water, and they liked and wanted lots of it. These aqueducts were built around the 1st century, and a German magazine called Der Spiegel, actually it's a newspaper, noted that the Romans daily used 500 liters, 132 gallons of water per capita, per head, while Germans today use around 125 liters, which is just 33 gallons. So in other words, the Romans of the past had access to far more water than Germans of the present day do. Now, you can fall right into aqueduct research and never get back up or out again. It's really fascinating. So I'm going to squirrel this topic as well, because there's just so much on it. On the left and the right are major maps that show how the aqueducts of Rome brought water into the city. And they had to be graded so that the incline was very slight but always down, so that gravity did the whole work of bringing the water to the city, and also allowed the sediment to settle as it was coming in. Now, there are about 500 miles of aqueducts that were built. And again, this is not equaled until almost the 19th century. The fellow that I am not having you read, Frontinus, the engineer of the Roman aqueducts, who wrote a nice diatribe on him, he was a kind of a nudge about accuracy, because he had gotten this position, the manager of the aqueducts, as a political plum. It was a political appointment. And yet he took it very seriously, and he cared that the water was clean and flowed well. So he did this big survey looking at all the different pipes and all the different sources and making sure that everything was running right. And he particularly wanted to make sure that water wasn't being stolen, because a lot of work in the Roman Empire was done by enslaved people. And if you're an enslaved person, what incentive do you have to be honest? Kind of none. So people would get their slaves, pay them to take water off the line or off the systems. And so he was concerned to check and make sure that that wasn't happening. And he knew perfectly well that the next person who was in this job might just be a political hack and not really care whether it was done well or not. So he wrote it all down with this kind of anxious, careful prose, giving you full, complete details of what it ought to be. And it makes for a wonderful read now. The Romans put up aqueducts all over the areas that they conquered and ran. So here's one on the left in Istanbul, and here's one on the right in France. They're a great example of science kind of hovering over a sink of wealth. This is something the Romans put a lot of time and energy into. It's still standing, these two today. They trained people, they observed what worked, and they built these structures everywhere, as I said. So having a lot of water for bathing and fountains and gardens and heated floors and clean city living, it's not mysterious. It's something, as an organizing idea, we can understand. This is what a good, comfortable life looks like. And I'll just also say that having good roads and clean water are still unrealized goals for many parts of the world, including parts of our own country. So have a look at Detroit or parts of Philadelphia next time you're feeling pretty smug about how much we know, and remind yourself that the Romans did pretty well in the past on these subjects. Now, ordinarily, the Greeks are discussed before the Romans, but in this case, I'd like to discuss Aristotle after the Romans because Aristotle's influence lasted well into the Middle Ages after the Roman Empire was gone. So now we're going to take up Aristotle. When we talk about Aristotle, the most important word is lengthy. Aristotle lived from 384 to 322 BCE. He lived in what we call the Hellenistic period, meaning that the Greeks had not yet been absorbed by the Roman Empire, but they had ceased to be completely independent city-states. Alexander the Great, who conquered most of the known world, started by conquering the Greeks, his own countrymen, and Aristotle, who was Greek, became Alexander's tutor. In his younger years, Aristotle moved around from city to city in Greece before he served as Alexander's tutor, and he founded a school called the Lyceum in Athens. He studied philosophy, politics, rhetoric, music, poetry, physics, and biology, among other subjects. There wasn't some kind of rule that's saying what you could or couldn't study, so he studied it all. And he wrote apparently 200 works, only 31 of which are available to us today. Now, his works on logic are densely argued, they're difficult to understand, but they are still studied in any introduction to philosophy course today. If you take an intro to philosophy course at NCC, you'll hear about Aristotle. So they've been influential for about, 2,300 years. His works on biology, by contrast, are really not widely read today. They are read, but not as widely. He made a considerable collection of real-time observations of nature, of animals and plants, and he organized those observations into a kind of schemata. He made conclusions about how animals grow, how they mate, and how they should be organized or classified to be understood. Those observations he made held on all the way through the Middle Ages, up to the 1300s and a little beyond. The churchmen of the Middle Ages, the people who could access his works and read them, found him to be a scholar they supported, and they really liked him, so he and his ideas were part of education for many years after he was gone. Now, the most influential of ideas that he codified, not originated but codified, made clear and set kind of in stone, were these two organizing questions. So the big organizing ideas of the world over on the right-hand side of our graph. One of them is, what is everything made of? What's the most basic unit of matter? And two is, how is the universe shaped? What does it look like? How does it function? So the first one, what is everything made of? He said there were 4 elements that everything was made of. He said that there was earth, air, water, fire. And actually, if you go in our little picture there, it would be earth, water, air, fire. But he thought that there are things that were cold or dry or wet or hot. And those are the qualifications of everything. And those ideas stuck on right through the Renaissance. They really weren't altered or revised significantly until the scientific revolution of the 17th or 18th centuries. So that's a long time to be revered. The other big thought that he had was one that everybody could see, which was that everything revolved around the Earth. So the Sun and Jupiter and 7 planets, everybody thought that the Earth was the center and everything revolved around the Earth. And you would watch the planets and the stars as a way of figuring out what to do and what not to do. These planets and stars had influences that you should take into account if you were going to do something. Medical issues were typically addressed by looking at the stars and adjusting what was going on with your humors And you had an imbalance, you were too hot, or you're too dry, or you're too cold, or you're too wet. You had to adjust something in your body, and you might have been thrown out of whack by something in the stars, but you had to do something in yourself in order to get better. So these two giant influencing ideas were things that everybody believed and lived by. And I'm wondering, in fact, if you believe these two things now, I wonder if your choices of what to do would be very different than your choices that you make now. So in other words, you don't believe this now, right? Nobody believes these things now. But a lot of times the things we actually do to react to trouble in life are not that different than the people in the past did. If everything went wrong today, you might just say, you know what, I need some more sleep. I need to go to bed. Forget it. I'll get up tomorrow. I had a bad, unlucky day, and I'm just going to start over tomorrow. You could have done that in 323 BCE, or you could do that yesterday. If you have a raging headache, maybe you'd say, you know what, I really need to get a wet cloth and wring it out and put it on my forehead. Well, that's the kind of solution that could have happened in the past, and it can happen now. You might say, hey, you know what, my sister has been restless and irritable for the last 3 months. She needs to make a change in her life. She needs to do something to change what she's doing. These kinds of solutions are not that different from past to present. And so I think it's interesting, even when we have very different organizing ideas, our practical approaches to problems may not be all that different. Well, two other big organizing ideas that I want you to pay attention to. This on the left is a model of the universe, when it was started and how it is expanding. And the current theory says that the Big Bang happened, we don't know how, it just did, 13.77 billion years ago, and that the universe has expanded from that point outward and outward and outward. We can see the background radiation showing us the movement of the stars, and curiously enough, they are moving farther and faster away all the time, as if the bang or the explosion is continuing to happen. And no one quite knows what's going to happen next. The advent of the Webb telescope is making some inroads into these maps, making us think a little differently. I'm really excited about this model because I think it's going to change, and I'm curious to see what we will get next. But that's one of the big ideas. What does the universe look like? How is it started? The notions of galaxies, of suns, of our own solar system, all of that is part of the history of science. And on the right-hand side, I've picked a picture by Bruegel of lunchtime. It's a Renaissance painter. And what you see is a whole bunch of people lying around at lunchtime, unpacking their lunch, getting something to drink. And it's a picture of time. It's a picture of seasons. It's a picture of a moment in a day. And our approaches to time have been very, very different. If you said to, say, a 9-year-old kid, if you said to them, oh, what a nice little 6-year-old you are, the 9-year-old kid would be completely indignant. What? No, I'm 9, I'm not 6. Right? They'd be mad. Kids are really invested in the passage of time because it's so important to them. And they're kind of cute and charming about how important it is. But if you said to somebody else, you know what, you're kind of an old lady, someone would say, no, I'm not an old lady, I'm just in my 50s, come on, right? So the notion of time and how we measure it and what it means to us, it changes when you're looking at a map of the universe or when you're looking at a map of your own life. And if you ask something like, is time money? Is this harvest insured? Maybe one of those people in the picture would say, look, ask me after lunch. So our attitudes towards time marks our personal lives as well as how the world's shaped, and as much as what we believe about ourselves and what we believe about the universe are all at stake in the history of science. Okay, so we teachers of history like timelines because it helps us remember stuff. So I'm just putting a timeline in front of you of some of the things that we've passed through in this lecture. So, and the lecture before, we have tool sites for Homo erectus. We have these realistic observations of portraits and animals in the cave paintings. We have Babylonian star observation that I noted. And I also noted for you that there is the Niebuhr sky disk, which is this beautiful disk capturing the Pleiades. I don't think I put that in the lecture, but there it is, and you can look it up. It's fabulous. And then we've also covered a little bit about the Greeks and the Romans. We're going to go back and look at the Chinese and the Arabic cultures that also contributed, and that will be in our next lecture.